right, welcome back everybody. This is the first video in a series that we're going to put together to have our own MCP client talking with a N8N MCP server that we're going to put together. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, well, Jeff, I've heard that stuff before, so why this particular video? What is it that's different about this one? Well, when I was learning how to use MCP servers and everything else, I was using other tools, whether it was ChatGPT, Claude, any number, and it was just a different workflow, and sometimes it would work, and I wasn't sure if it was the way that I integrated it into one of the platforms or if it was my MCP server itself. So I was just like, I need to at least verify that my MCP server is up and running regardless of any other tool. So therefore, I was like, hey, I'm just going to put this client together. And so that's what we're doing here, is putting together a client that you can reliably count on to verify that your MCP server is doing what you think it should be doing, at least at the functional layer. So really, this is going to be a video series focused on the communications between your client and your MCP server. We're not going into a whole bunch of complex MCP stuff. This is really going to be focused on understanding how to get the client to communicate. So no matter what you're doing with your MCP server, you'll always have this client to at least fall back on to start verifying whether it's another client that you're working on that's a problem, or if it's the MCP server itself that's the problem. And with all that being said, the whole thing's going to be simple and straightforward. I'm not going through and saying, hey, let's randomly do this huge to-do list application that nobody's ever going to use, and then 30 minutes down the road we're worrying about if a button is blue or chartreuse. That has nothing to do with the communications. So there's not going to be anything pretty on this. It is straightforward. It is giving you a reliable client to test your MCP server. So that's what this video is, really the video series is going to be all about. The benefits of that, in my opinion, are really, you're relying on your own tool set to verify what you need. There's nothing saying you can't put it into, ChatGPT or Claude or anything else, and it works fine. But if something starts going haywire in there, at least you have something to fall back on to verify whether or not it's your client, your tools, or your MCP server itself. Now, with that, you're going to need a couple of things, because we are going to be building out the client in TypeScript, and it's just going to be a command line. TypeScript, no web page, no nothing, just simple command line. So you do need to have npm and Node both installed, as well as TypeScript, because we're going to be using the TSC command, right? TypeScript compiler. And then the only account that you're going to need is an N8N account. So obviously you can talk to an N8N MCP server, but we're not going to be using ChatGPT or Claude or anything else. This is going to be your client. So taking a look at, a little bit more visually what we're going to be building. The TypeScript to the left, that's what we're going to be putting the code together for in this video. Just the infrastructure, just the configuration and setting up that TypeScript. We're not going to be connecting to an MCP server yet because we haven't developed it yet. In the next video, we will be developing the MCP server. And the MCP server, like I said, is going to be pretty straightforward. A little get and set sort of thing for Google Sheets. But again, the priority is understanding how to communicate with any MCP server. So part one, this part, we're going to be putting together the initial TypeScript, just the bare bones, getting it configured, set up, ready to go. In the next video, we'll be putting the MCP server together. And then in the third video, we will be putting the whole thing together. We'll connect up our TypeScript client to our MCP server. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump right into the initial TypeScript code, and we'll come back after that, just kind of do a quick review and get ready for the next video. All right, so here we are at the terminal, and we're going to go ahead and just get everything set up. In this directory, we can see that I just have this completely blank directory, and I've got VS Code up here. It's got that directory open. It's obviously this YouTube tutorial, right? Empty, nothing going on. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do an npm init, and this is just going to initialize everything, and I'm going to completely accept all of the defaults with the caveat of the entry point. And here I'm going to go ahead and put in main.ts because we're going to be doing everything in TypeScript, not JavaScript. So we're going to want something that has that .ts extension. From there, I'm just going to accept all of the defaults. I just hit the enter key a whole bunch of times. The next thing that we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and set up and configure our TypeScript. And we're going to use the tsc command for that. And again, it's just tsc init. However, we're going to do a couple of other things. The first thing is we're going to do the source map. And all of this source map really is, it's when you transpile your TypeScript code into JavaScript, this allows you to have some debug symbols, right? So you can put breakpoints in your code, things along those lines. The next thing that we're going to want is a root directory, if I can type, and we're going to make that our source directory. And this is just saying, where do we find our source files? Main.ts, foo.ts, whatever it may be, what directory is that? And in this case, it's going to be our source directory. We are also going to want our output directory, in this case just outdir, and there is our bin directory, right? Our binary directory, if you will. And this is where our JavaScript is actually going to go. So when we transpile our TypeScript, where does all that JavaScript go? It's going to go into this bin directory, right? So we're going to go ahead. That happens pretty quick. Now there's a couple things that we need to do just to make sure everything is pretty much in order. And so the first thing that we need to do is make certain that that source and bin directory that we just said is going to be our root directory and our output directory. Just need to make sure those are actually there. So I'm just going to do a make dir on source and bin. And then we said that our main entry point was going to be main.ts. And so we want to make certain that we get that installed as well. And so what we're going to do to make certain that that main.ts is actually there and becomes our main point of entry for our app is I'm just going to run the touch command on the source directory main.ts and actually go ahead and create it. All right, and so once that's created, when we come back over into our VS Code, we can see that we have that main TS, we have the source and the bin. And then in here, I'm just going to do something really quick to confirm that everything works. And we'll just do foo. Okay. Now go ahead and save that. And I'm going to open up a terminal. And here in VS Code, I'm just going to do a TSC, right? That's pretty much getting our TypeScript into Java. Oh, I'm sorry, into JavaScript. And then we are going to run our application and everything is set up, right? So now that we have the actual project set up and running, what we need to do now is set it up with our actual code. Now there's going to be two phases to this. In this first video, it's just going to be setting it up with pretty much generic TypeScript, being able to read in from the command line, right? We're just going to be reading in whether or not we're going to get something from our MCP server or if we're going to set something inside of our MCP server. But this right here is going to be setting it up to make certain that we can communicate with our N8N MCP server. So with that, that's what this next part of this first video is going to be. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into that. All right, so let's go ahead and get some of the dependencies installed that we're ultimately going to need, right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install a couple of development dependencies. And the first one that we're going to do is TypeScript. Now, this does install TypeScript locally with the TSC and a few other things. If you have it all set up, this may have some redundancy to it, but I always put it in there just pretty much for a sanity check. No harm, no foul. It's a dev dependency. The other dev dependency that we're going to want to make certain that we have installed is we're going to have our types node installed as well. And what this is going to do, when we start pulling in other libraries, if those other libraries have JavaScript symbols in them, this is going to pretty much translate those into our TypeScript so we can actually use them. If you don't do this one, you're gonna run into some problems. So once that's all set up, we're done. We're pretty much good to go. That's pretty much our standard TypeScript. Now, one of the things that we're going to need right off the bat is to do an npm install of .env. And the reason that we're pulling in .env is because ultimately our N8N server or N8N MCP server is going to be using bear tokens and things along those lines. And so we're obviously going to put that, not in something that we commit to our repositories, but rather something that we have in our .env file, right? And so we're going to want that. And once we have that installed, we are pretty much ready to go. So with that, let's go ahead and start jumping in and looking at the code that we're going to need for our MCP client. Okay, so right off the bat, we need to just pull in some imports. We're going to pull in our path. And the reason that we're going to pull in our path initially is because ultimately we are going to have some log files from our MCP server and a few other things. And so we're going to want that. The next thing that we're going to import is our .env. And that obviously comes from our .env. Now this one is again to read from, well, no pun intended, but the .env file that we're going to use. Now for this first part of our development for our MCP client, we're also going to want to import just readline. And the readline is exactly what it is, right? So we're on a terminal application. So we're going to have users putting in, ABC 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be, and we're going to be reading from the command line. And so this read line is what we're going to be using for that. So that's all we need for the imports initially. And then what we need to do is just set up our .env file. Oops. I do think that the VS Code completion gets a little overambitious sometimes. But regardless, here we have our .env setup, right? And so that's pretty much all we're going to need to read in from our .env later. Now what we're going to do is set up the actual code to read in from the command line, right? So whether or not the user types in A, B, C, whatever. And so we're going to go let that code kind of run through pretty quick, and we'll come back and talk about that here in just a minute. All right, so what I want to do really quick is just talk about this function right here for ask question, right? Whatever. You can call it whatever you want. Prompt the user, get answer, get input, whatever. The future promise, right? Because obviously you're sitting there waiting for the user to type something in. But here, all that we are doing is we're setting up the string that the user is going to see, right? And we're getting our read line, right? Our RL right here, read line. We're getting it from this standard in, standard out, right? So we're going to read it in from standard in, i.e. our console, and then we're going to write it to the same standard output, i.e. again, our console. Once they type something in, right, we're going to be looking for an S, a G, or an X. They type in something else, whatever, we'll ask them again. And then we have this set MCP, we have this get MCP, and then we just keep on asking a question until the user decides that they want to exit the application. And so that's all that this is doing, right? A little bit, the syntax is a little convoluted for TypeScript, but regardless, you get the idea. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go ahead and put in these kind of placeholder functions for set and get MCP, and we'll actually be able to run through this application here just to see where we are so far in this first video setting up our MCP client. So let me go ahead and get that in. We'll kind of rush through the code and then we'll talk about it. All right, so really quick, just kind of finishing off what we're looking at here. Right, we've got our path, our .env, our read line. We've got everything set up for our .config. We'll put on our .env, and then we read in from the console. That's pretty much it that we have so far. And this is the skeleton that we'll be using. It's standard TypeScript, nothing spectacular going on here, but this is our MCP client that we will be using. So here, we're just gonna go ahead and run our TypeScript command, and then from there, we'll run this just to make sure everything's good to go, right? So when we type in an S, we set something on the MCP server. When we type in G, we get something back from the MCP server. And when we type in X, we go ahead and exit out of our MCP client, so we're not asking for anything from the MCP server. And just to kind of finish off this video, right, we'll just do a touch.env. All right, and so now that our env is in here, it's obviously empty, and we'll be filling this in the next video. But make sure that you go and take a look at this code so you can pull it down. All right, so we saw that we just simply set up our TypeScript client, right? And I mean bare bones, right? We got it reading in input, and all the functions are in there. They're skeletons of the real thing, but the gist of it's in there. And later on, when we actually have an MCP server to connect to, we'll start adding in all of that other information. So that was step one. Step two in the next video is setting up the N8N MCP server. And then finally, in the third video is where we'll get all the calls into the TypeScript to actually ping away and hit our MCP server. And one thing, just kind of leave everybody with the code for the video series here. Here's the URL. It's up on GitHub. Feel free to pull it down, do whatever you want to do with it. Just remember to set up your .env. But other than that, everything's up there. So with all that, that was the first video, and we will see you in the next one where we will start setting up our N8N MCP server. All right? Take care, everybody.